Welcome to our third three-book Friday. I'm Nick Triplow, writer and co-founder of Noir, and along with my fellow writer and co-founder of Noir, Nick Quantrill, we'll be asking our guests to choose the three books that have most influenced them as writers and readers, and to discuss what makes them must-reads. The format's quite straightforward, as it has been before. It's a book that you've been given, a book that you'd give or recommend to somebody else, and a book that's influenced each of our guests as writers. If you want to get involved via social media when we go live on the 28th of June, please do so and use the hashtag 3Book Friday, Noir 3Book Friday, and that'll be in the description box below. And please remember to like and subscribe. I don't know why, but that's what people say on podcasts and things. So I'm going to pass over to Nick now to introduce our writers for June.
Yes, thanks, Nick. Yeah, like and subscribe. That's a good thing, isn't it? Like and subscribe. So yeah, our two guests. We'll start with Heather. So Heather, to my left, was born in Australia and read languages at Cambridge and ultimately lectured in Spanish at the University of Hull. So that's a nice link to our festival straight away. And King's College London. More recently, after working as a freelance editor and translator, she returned to academia as visiting fellow in the Department of Comparative Literature at City University, New York. But she never planned to become a biographer once the idea of writing the lead child story took hold. The Reaper guy felt somehow meant to be. So that's Heather. And just diagonally underneath me is Joe. Joe Thomas is an international man of mystery, as he has no social media accounts or a website, which makes it very difficult to find out information. But what we do know, Joe is the author of the Sao Paulo Quartet Noir novels published by Arcadia, Paradise City, Gringa, Playboy, and the recently published Brazilian Psycho. And Joe is also the author of Bentley's first London crime novel. When not writing, Joe's a creative writing group, I believe. Excellent. Smashing. So we'll get into it, shall we? Let's get into it. So the first book was a favourite book that he was given. So shall we start with you, Heather? Ladies first. You tell us about the book you've chosen as a favourite book he was given, because it's I can see the link, I think, as to why it would be, but I'll let you introduce the book.
Okay, great. Well, this is not the only copy of this book I own, Labyrinths by Jorge Luis Borges, but it is the original copy. And as you can see, I'm literally holding it together at the seams. It was given to me at university, and I guess it was a bit of a rite of passage, quite resistant on first reading, but ever after, never ceasing to give. And also part of a bigger story. Like you said, I'm from Australia, and I came over as a teenager with the idea of becoming a classical guitarist. But I ended up living in a house full of Venezuelans in North London, all of whom also wanted to be guitarists. And, you know, I learned Spanish and I went to university. And by the time I got to the PhD stage, I actually had the privilege of meeting Borges, which was incredible. And, you know, he's probably really my only true literary hero. So yeah, part of a bigger personal story. But Labyrinths is a collection of stories and essays. But the great thing is you can barely tell the difference between them, which is one of the things I like about it. This book does not include possibly his most famous story, The Aleph, which has a 429-word sentence that's longer than a lot of his stories, which describes the Aleph as a 5-centimeter sphere that contains the entire inconceivable universe without diminution of size. But I mention it because that's the perfect metaphor for any Borges story. Compact, gem-like, polished, you know, as condensed as poetry, somehow managing to evoke the whole of human history and endeavor. And I guess I particularly like the way he takes an idea and pushes it to or even beyond the limit. So, you know, what would it be like if we really did have a perfect memory, or we could make the perfect map, or build the perfect library, or write the perfect book? And what might be the consequences of that, both personal and intellectual? So he's kind of a witty, erudite, playful. He's a master of the wry parenthesis, very dry sense of humor. And he mixes real and bogus references in his writing, without distinction, never lets on which is which is actually something, funnily enough, that the young Lee Child used to do as a schoolboy, probably rather annoyingly for his teachers. And also he was a great linguist. So yeah, we've got a lot in common, you're right, Nick. Well, sorry, that sounds terrifically immodest, but you know what I mean. Yeah, he's a great linguist and collector of words, and loved to reclaim half-forgotten words that have fallen out of common parlance. So I really enjoy all those aspects of his work, and there are three stories, well, his stories in general are constant points of reference to me, and his essays. And that includes three that are in this volume. The Garden of Forking Paths, which is a detective story and was first published in English in 1948 in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. And but also The Library of Babel and Funes, The Memorials, and I can't escape those stories. I could just as easily have chosen this for my third book, because these days, after many years of reading this very battered book, it's just, Borges just permeates every aspect of my reading and my writing. So an inescapable influence.
Can I just ask, Heather, just looking, doing a little bit of research for this, there are several translations, aren't there?
Yeah.
And I wondered if there was a translation that as a linguist you'd recommend.
They all have their merits, but I'm probably not the right person to ask, because I've often just translated his stories because they're so short, because I like them so much, and because it's a really good way of getting to know them, almost like if you're studying a piece of music or something. I've often just translated them myself. Right, okay. So Andrew Hurley's great, but I think they have got their merits, and actually it's really interesting to compare them. But one of the wonderful things about Borges, and this is utterly genuine, I said he was a great linguist, obviously his English is brilliant. He always maintained, and he did this when I met him, he maintained that he much preferred his own stories in English. So he liked all the translations. He embraced his work in translation and said he thought basically his writing was much better in English than in Spanish. So very relaxed kind of guy about that sort of thing. Just enjoying, just reveling really in language in all its forms and cultures.
Is he on your radar, Joe, as a reader?
Yeah, I read, and when I was teaching in South America, in Sao Paulo, at the British International School, I taught. I'm having a blank as to which text it was, but I did teach one of his texts to sixth formers, which was interesting, and not very high achieving sixth formers. So it was quite an experience which was fascinating because of the approach. I mean, they were enthusiastic, they were readers. That sounded a bit critical, but I think that there's a perception perhaps that he's a difficult author, isn't there? And I found it was incredibly accessible, and yeah.
It's fascinating, sorry to cut across you, but it just strikes such a chord, because I actually, taught for quite a long spell taught languages, taught Spanish in primary school. And I used to bring Borges in there because I knew that the kids would love his crazy imagination, basically his wild imagination. And, I would take not whole stories, but paragraphs, concepts, a sentence, and I'd obviously do all the work of translation. But it was quite inspirational. And that long sentence that I mentioned in the Aleph, which every phrase in it begins with the sort of past tense of the verb to see, it was actually incredibly easy for the children to have a go at writing that sort of sentence themselves in Spanish, So I do think that, people need to get beyond the idea of him being difficult. But that's what I said about him being resistant on first reading.
Yeah, fantastic. So Joe, you've picked us the Claire DeWitt novels by Sarah Grand, which is interesting because they're not novels I've read, but I've had so many crime writers who I respect have kind of picked out Sarah Grand as somebody that should be wider read and wider known. So give us an introduction to your choice, please.
Yeah, well, firstly, I'll say there's a kind of Borgesian element to the novels in some ways. I think the kind of the idea that the mystery within the books is, and the unraveling is the point of the mystery rather than the mystery itself, or something like that. And the reason why I chose these books, it was a difficult one, to be honest. That first category of being a book you were given, because And I was racking my brains, looking at my bookshelves, thinking, which books has anyone ever given me that I've actually liked? And it doesn't happen very often. And also in my family, I'm the sort of the person that probably reads most, alongside my mum and dad too. But you know, I almost chose the Picador book of sports writing that my dad gave me when I was 18, because that's a fantastic kind of compendium of sports writing. And in the end, I was thinking, well, I'm given books by publishers, and one of my closest and oldest friends is an editor at Faber. Angus Cargill is his name, and he publishes a lot of American crime and a lot of crime fiction, which is of the stylish side, let's say. And he gave me the first Sarah Grand novel of this series, City of the Dead, and then that follow-up, Bohemian Highway, Claire DeWitt and the Bohemian Highway, and then the most recent one is The Infinite Blacktop. I'm going to focus on this one purely because, and this is another link with the guitar, if you look very carefully there, we have a Claire DeWitt plectrum, which is on the cover, which Angus, he said it's probably it was the worst piece of publicity budget he'd ever spent. it looks cool. So why do I like it? I recommend it because it's a singular voice. She's writing the kind of crime fiction that I admire and wanted to write, if not in the same vein, but the same idea of working within a genre and against it. So working within the constraints of form, but also trying to subvert them. The Claire DeWitt character is fascinating. There's a sort of darkness. It's going to sound reductive to say she's a sort of lone, strong, independent woman, but these things are true. She's a cerebral private detective, and her mysteries involve tracking down and understanding things that are going on both in her life and more widely in society. That all sounds fairly straightforward in the sense of a PI, a troubled or PI, but the other fascinating element to it is there is a fictional detective manual called the Détection, I think is how you pronounce it, by Jacques Sillette, and so she's written this kind of metaphysical detective text that runs through all three novels, and he is like the greatest private detective that ever existed, and she is now the world's greatest detective. And each of the novels have elements of her childhood and how she developed as a person to reach this kind of stage of transcendence. And that sounds, again, it's slightly cartoonish, but it's really not. It's a very, very sort of, the tone is brilliant. All of those things I've just said don't do it justice. They all sound either, not cliched, but of a trope, of a type, or, as I say, slightly cartoonish. But the fact is, the combination of that with this very clear writing is terrific. I think it's so hard to do crime fiction in the first person as well. I'm not convinced there are that many good crime novels written in the first person. That's a massive generalization, but she does it beautifully. So I'm a big fan. I'm going to just read one sentence from the Jacques Sillette at the end. So in these things, he says, "All knowledge will be free for the taking, including the biggest mystery of all, who we really are." That's the kind of meta text that runs through it. So So as I said, these are books I might have chosen anyway, but in terms of the gift, it was a light bulb. I thought, oh yeah, of course. And obviously, I knew nothing about her as a writer until I was given the books, and I used that as my kind of criteria for choosing them.
Absolutely, looking at reading some clips and stuff that I could find online this afternoon. Very definitely, there are books I'd really like to get and start to read. They're sort of quite challenging. We're going to move on now to the next category. And so, Heather, if you could give us the book that you would pass on or that you'd recommend.
Yeah, so this one's a novel, and it's So the Doves, beautiful title, by Heidi James, published in 2017 by Blue Moose Books, a brilliant indie. If you haven't checked out their list, do it because you won't regret it. And it's not the first of her books I read. That was The Sound Mirror, which probably has the most intense opening page of any book I've read in many a long year. She's a natural storyteller, so you're gripped, from first page to last, and you don't want it to finish, and you're sorry when it's over. But I also love her writing line by line, which for me really seals the deal. And So the Doves is a love story. It's a kind of coming of age story. It's cold case crime fiction. social and political commentary with a terrific sense of time and place, set mainly in the Medway towns where James grew up. It's also an exploration of ideas, sort of, and it is and does all those things seamlessly, weaving back and forth between first-person narration in the present and third-person narration in the recollected past, which obviously gives it a kind of depth and resonance, which I really enjoy as well. But as Lee Child always says, character is king, and the characters in this book are unforgettable. The main character is female, but she is sort of by plot and by nature elusive. And we see her only through the eyes of her one-time best friend, who's now a journalist, you know, kind of one step removed from the detective, really. And he finds himself in the position of having to reconstruct her life on the basis of a combination of memory and imagination, and increasingly coming to terms with the realization that those two things are quite hard to separate, and that even when he was in her presence back in the day, he was seeing her through the lens of imagination and desire, and that we're telling stories about ourselves and each other all the time as part of the fabric of everyday life. I think probably like anyone or anyone who reads this book, I really want it to be Mel. She doesn't, her life is not a bed of roses, but she's super cool. But the truth is that I really identified more with Marcus because he is kind of her biographer. And I related very strongly to that. Although I only read this book a few months ago, had I read it, I think, when I was writing The Reacher Guy, it could have provided me with all sorts of epigraphs, or, you know, I'm sure I would have quoted from it. For example, the great line when he says, confesses rather disarmingly, it's not as simple as I thought. I mean, yeah. I could really relate to that. And James doesn't oversimplify, and when the resolution comes, and there is a terrific twist, it's poised and it's poignant and it's subtle. So yeah, I kind of wholeheartedly recommend this book as one to read and one to give. So the Doves by Heidi James. And as just a little footnote, I've actually got a piece coming out in Lit Hub on the 28th, I think, all being well, which compares the writing of Lee Child and Heidi James, which I think might come as a surprise. It's something a bit different. Yeah. And obviously on the basis of my own rather eccentric reading.
Yeah, would you read it?
No, I've not read it. Is it? Would you class it as a crime novel or such? Because it did win the.
It is definitely. It is definitely a crime novel. Yeah, it's definitely a crime novel. It's it features the police doing an investigation. It features corruption among the police, and as I say, the journalist character, who is the narrator, is conducting his own investigation, and it does. The whole thing is a mystery essentially. Yeah. There's a crime at the core of it, and that's the mystery that you're wanting to be solved.
Yeah. I mean, I asked because obviously Blue Moose is a brilliant independent publisher, isn't it? They're not far from us, they're in Yorkshire, but they don't tend to be one I associate with crime publishing. So
no, but I think the great thing about them is that they're very open to all genres, and they're just looking for the great writers, the writers with a distinctive voice, and she certainly has that.
Brilliant. Joe, can you tell us about the books that you'd give or recommend?
I can't show you the book because I've given it to someone actually in the kind of appropriate fashion.
Perfect.
It's the book I chose was A Place of Greatest Safety by Hilary Mantel, which I think arguably is the finest and most exciting and entertaining reading experience I've ever had. Possibly. A couple of years ago, I was staying with my partner and her parents in Normandy, and it was very hot. Martha was pregnant with our son, and I spent 2 weeks lying around reading this 1,000-page epic about the French Revolution. Obviously, Mantel is very well known now for the Cromwell trilogy, but this was her first novel, full stop, I think. And it was in a drawer for a long time, and apparently she sort of talked about it in the newspaper, and then her editor said, "You've got this book," and then it came out, and you can see it's flawed in some ways. It's 800 to 1,000 pages, as I said, depending on the edition, I suppose. And what is so exciting is the freewheeling nature of it, the way she combines all sorts of forms. She writes in the present tense, the past tense, the first person, the third person. She uses extracts from newspapers, journals, all sorts of things. And she writes with such verve, and it's so funny, and she's got these three wonderful characters, Danton, Desmoulins, and Robespierre, and she brings them through the kind of the trials and tribulations of the revolution, pre and post, and their own trial, building to it, and she's got such a good sense of humor, I think, and it's earthy and kind of dirty as well. And she and I was writing Brazilian Psycho at that moment, and it really opened a door for me too, because I was trying to figure out how to do something with the novel, because it's quite a big book. It's 500 pages. It covers 16 years. I was tussling with a whole load of plots and subplots and trying to do it, and I wasn't sure about something I was doing, and I saw Mantell doing it and thought, well, that's fine. She's doing it, and I can, which was mixing things up, basically, just not really. And I would normally set myself fairly strict guidelines with writing the novels, in terms of, the first one being from one perspective, with bent very, very, very specific forms for each section. And so when I read A Place of Greater Safety and saw that this kind of, as I said, freewheeling is a good word to describe it. And the different uses, I suddenly realized that, yeah, you can do that. And I wonder if it's such an entertaining read. I'd say the Cromwell novels are probably better from a kind of, if you're thinking of them from a kind of critical perspective, but this, I don't think you can beat it for entertainment. It's funny. There's every now and again I'll be talking to someone and it'll be this little secret. Oh, have you read that? And then suddenly you get each other. One of my close friends and first readers, Lucy Caldwell, we've known each other for years until we've suddenly discovered that we both love this book, and then you find it from someone else. It's one of those, obviously not as popular or as well known, but I think it's absolute treat.
And it's got that remarkable inspiration for a writer that she wrote it between 1974 and 79, and it sat in a drawer until 1992.
Yeah,
incredible.
Never give up. Never ever give up.
No, exactly. It's fascinating. And she sort of, I think, again, I'm not 100% sure, but I think she was struggling with her health when she wrote it as well, and it was a form of recuperation as well. It sounded like a fairly kind of intense experience, the writing of it. And it's nice to see the author's note with that distance and the way she talks about it. There's also a great line from her author's note that I put into my author's note for Brazilian Psycho, which is something like, if the reader finds it difficult to tell fact from fiction, the more unlikely it seems it's probably true. Something like that. It's a great kind of idea of what you can do basing fiction on fact.
That's brilliant. I'm kind of conscious of the time here, so I'm going to pass back to Nick to take us through
the third section. Yeah. So this is one I love. This one is a book that's influenced your own writing. This is really getting into what kind of makes you think as a writer, I think. So for you, Heather, you've picked a memoir, which is about Private Avenue, Daniel Mendelsohn. So tell us a bit more about this title that you've chosen and how it links into the writing of the Reacher Guide for you.
Yeah, well, it's narrative nonfiction, so kind of close to my genre, I guess, by American classicist Daniel Mendelsohn, an Odyssey, a father, a son, and an epic. It was recommended to me by Lee, who is himself a closet classicist, and I gave it to my younger son, who read it and loved it, and then I stole it back and I read it and I loved it. And I read it just before I started writing The Reacher Guide in earnest, and just before I moved to New York for that year. And it was, I guess, just generally inspirational and empowering. It's a personal story. Mendelsohn's writing about his aging father, who's a retired research scientist, so a man of facts and figures, who takes it into his head to join his son's seminar on the Odyssey, which obviously allows a lot of scope for affection and humor. And again, it moves back and forth in time. Now the son is father as teacher to the father, but it goes back to his boyhood and to his father's boyhood, and back, of course, to classical antiquity. It's a great way of approaching the Odyssey if you haven't read it, and then revisiting it if you have. But I think, because it's a meditation on that text as well as the father-son relationship, but I think it was that mix of memoir and literary criticism that kind of gave me permission to approach the biography in a personal way and not feel too constrained by convention. And also another thing I'd say is that what he has to say about oral storytelling is just fascinating. I knew that that was the voice that Lee was after for his own sort of wandering Homeric, hero. And he wanted that from the outset, and I think you can see that, or more properly, hear it, feel it, sense it in the rhythm of his prose, and also in his rather chorus-like use of repetition, which, by the way, Joe, I noticed is a feature of your writing, or certainly of Playboy, which I just read, which had, kind of a very insistent, hypnotic kind of beat running right the way through it. So that, reminded me of this book too. But I think with Lee, even though he set out to write with that voice, he wanted to be the #1 voice in the New York Times bestseller list, not the #1 author. And even though he set out with that idea, I think it reaches its apogee, its culmination in his writing in his 22nd book, The Midnight Line, which not only has a ring as its central conceit, but is an example of what Mendelssohn calls ring composition, kind of pushing the narrative forward through time to a chronological conclusion, which Reach's story must do, but also allowing itself to loop back and pick up details from the past and build what Mendelssohn nicely calls associative spirals of meaning, which he argues is the way we tell stories in real life and familiar settings. And that was obviously hugely relevant to me as a biographer, because anyone who picks up the Reacher guy knows already that Lee Child is the author of a bunch of bestsellers. They don't need me to tell them that, but the books only kick in the mid-90s, and I had to start his story in 1954 when he was born and go back to his parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, just like Mendelssohn. And I needed that same freedom to loop back and forth in time without really any inhibition, to treat sort of the man, Lee Child, and his books as one. So yeah, great book, highly recommended.
Fantastic. And for you, Joe, you've picked one of my favorites, actually, American Tabloid by James Ellroy. And I think that kind of links into what Heather was saying, doesn't it, about the style of writing, because this is, I think for me, it's a novel when Ellroy's writing changes, isn't it? It goes from being those 1950s novels, which are quite easy to read and follow, to something that becomes a really dense labyrinth of information that I remember reading it and loving every single word of it, and having a sense of being none the wiser as to what actually happened by the end of the book. but yeah, I think there's definitely something there in the styles that translates to your writing in the Sao Paulo Quartet.
Yeah, this was a bit of a revelation. This one particularly, it's the first hour I read, in fact, and I hadn't read him before writing my first book, but I did. I then read. I was recommended and read this book, and it is incredibly stylish. I think it's when he's writing at his best, because he combines that style with an accessibility and a very, very dense, as the word you said, dense labyrinth of a plot, and it does. You can see the incredibly the sort of very, very well, the structure of it has a tightness and tautness that is pulled sort of like a thread, but across 500 pages, and in such a way that, as you say, when you reach the kind of the end and the climax, there might be an element of you're not quite sure how you got there, but it seems like it's unfolded kind of inevitably, which obviously is the sort of goal, I think, of a piece of prose, is that sort of inevitability at the end. The reason why I particularly like it is, one, the style, the kind of muscularity of the prose, the kind of grandstanding nature. In this case, where he keeps it kind of under control. In some of the other novels, sometimes it can feel that there's a bit too much of Ellroy in there. But this one, it's all about the character. It's all about the story. Very much style and service to the story, I think. The other reason why I particularly liked it is the idea of the factual basis, and then men, in this case it's three men, under the surface of power. People who are pulling strings and orchestrating things for those in power, but we're looking at the ones sort of just below that surface. And I found with my novels that with each one has become more and more rooted in fact. The Paradise City was rooted in it was influenced and based by a particular thing that happened to me, and it was set around a couple of corruption scandals and you know, real life institutions. But then after that, Gringo, Playboy, Brazilian Psycho, and then Bent, of course, in a different way, as the historical novel. All of those have been more and more concerned with fact and weaving fictional narratives around what happened as a way of perhaps trying to illuminate truth in some way, or to tell the story of a city. I feel that my novels aren't necessarily good in terms of crime novels. We don't really have a whodunit. There are crimes, but I don't really ever try and solve those crimes, I don't think. And reading Elroy was a way of understanding that it's not perhaps the solving of the crime that's interesting, but seeing how the crime pans out and where that crime is. I kind of, you know, I'm interested in particularly in text and writing that looks at kind of the discourses of power. That, you know, David Peace is a big influence too, and his quartet. Red Riding Quartet and then the Tokyo books do that as well, you know, uncovering and looking at the layers of society. So those are kind of the big influence ideas of the Elroy novel, especially American Tabloid. But the other reason is the sheer entertainment of it, of scene by scene. They're fairly short chapters, and they tend to be quite explosive. And he tends to deal with men, and you know, there aren't many women in his novels, but he tends to deal with men who are on the verge of some kind of crisis or going through it, and we see the chaos of the city through the eyes of these people committing these acts, and many of them seem to be kind of close to some kind of redemption, and you're sort of rooting for them, but you can see it's not going to work out. And there's a I wouldn't call it a nihilistic sort of worldview, but there is a you know, a hopelessness perhaps, but I wonder if it's not a bleak view. I don't think that these are misanthropic novels in general. I don't think Elroy's a writer that is looking to paint a particularly bleak portrait. I think that it's a reality and a realism that he's after, and I feel that it's realistic to look at corrupt structures and tell stories that show how they exist. And I think American Tabloid was a massive eye opener for me to try for that big canvas but tight plot. So yeah.
I recognise Playboy too.
Yeah. Are you a reader of Elroy, Heather?
Yeah, a little. I mean, I'm not a particular aficionado, but yeah. So I'm going to read more Joe Thomas, I think.
Excellent choice. I think.
Do you think that canvas you're talking about, that kind of broader sweep of a canvas, do you think that's possible in a British novel? I know it's an American novel thing, isn't it? But do you think it's doable on a British scale?
I hope so, because I'm trying to do something at the moment. My next project is a trilogy, a series of novels that will run from 1978 to 1990, set in Hackney in London, where I grew up, and looking at true crime, corruption, institutional racism, and then counterculture music as well. So it starts at the Rock Against Racism concert in 1978. The first book is called White Riot. The second book, Red Menace. Third book, True Blue. So I'm hopeful that they can do it. I'm going to try.
That sounds brilliant.
Yeah. Please crack on, Joe. Please crack on with them.
Yeah. Well, the first White Riot's is done, and it's all looking like it's all going ahead. I'm not sure of the scheduling yet, but I'm finding my way into Red Menace at the moment. But it's as you said, you know, that canvas. And if you think about, I wanted to look at a period. It's the same with Brazilian Psycho. 2003, Lula comes into power, socialist president. 2019, Bolsonaro is inaugurated. There's a canvas. How do you look at that period of time? And I think Playboy, you know, is very short. It's over a week or so. but I was hoping that it stitched together bigger things, and I'm starting to see that the time as well can happen.
Yeah, it's compressed, but it opens out, you know, onto a very big picture, and I think it gives you that sense of scale, even in that one volume.
Brilliant,
Yeah,
right, fantastic. I think we need to draw a line under it there, unfortunately, because we're going to run out of time shortly. So, huge thanks, Heather and Joe. I mean, Heather, the Reacher guy is out now, isn't it? That's out in hardback at the moment. Brazilian Psycho just published, Joe, out in paperback now. I've got it on my Kindle.
Yeah, hardback at the moment.
Right, and brilliant. And we're back next month with more. So thank you very much. Thank you, Nick, as usual, and we will see you all soon.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.